and it's going to be notes on questions of judging priority and authenticity, that is, among paintings. If you have two paintings, how do you judge which one is the earlier and the more likely to be from the real hand of the artist? And so on. It's a rather complicated matter, which I'll spend quite a bit of time on. Well, I'm going to use examples from the previous lectures, which are familiar to you somewhat, but saying more about them, but also bring in some others in the second half of this, which come from later periods, which illustrate my points better. I think these are extremely important matters, and this will kind of tie up the whole series in a way. A lot of it will be controversial in that not everybody agrees with this, but I think it's important nonetheless. Okay, we begin, first slides please, with the two details from the two versions of the Nymph of the Law River. The two divine figures, goddesses, floating up in the air. You will remember, if some of you will anyway, that when I discussed these, I pointed out the difference between the drawing of them and how in what I take to be the earlier version, the Liaoning version, on the left, the figures are drawn so that the volume of the figures and the space between them can be read, and the ribbons that flutter around them go around them and define their three-dimensionality and so on. You remember all that. Whereas in the Beijing version, the copyist, as I take it to be, flattens them, and the figures have no volume, and their ribbons don't work that way, and so on. Okay, this is pretty straightforward. Next, please. Now, then I went on to talk about boats, as you remember. Again, the Liaoning version, which I take to be the earliest and best, is relatively readable. Features such as this kind of ladder-like thing built on the deck, which the boatmen push against as they pull the boat, or the way the ribbons in the upstairs hanging from the balcony, from the canopy, blow effectively and believably in the real one, and hang down straight and are misunderstood in the copy, in the Beijing version, which is on the right now. And then there was still a third version in the Freer Gallery, which all these, what seemed to me to be wrong matters, go further wrong. And I took it to be a copy of the Beijing version. So if that's true, then we have three versions, so three in chronological order. All right, that was relatively simple, if I'm right. Anyway, now then another pairing that I used in the lectures, less easy in this case, is the two pictures, two versions of the painting attributed at the left, the section with people arriving at a temple, which we'll see a temple in the trees with big roofs, which we see is the main section in the main painting. By this time, we're corresponding to the main painting, and then if we were to go one further, we would see here the passage where the whole thing disappears or goes off into the misty distance, and the river, and the villages along the way in the city. Well, this corresponds so nicely to the real painting that we can, I think, take the earlier part to be an indication of how it began. So here is the beginning of the present scroll now. We miss all the sections at the beginning, which I would take to be the section in which our ideal figures, the people who populate the scroll, along with fishermen and farmers and so forth, lower class figures, in which they set off from their place where they are living, along with the common people out in nature. Okay, here at any rate is the first part of the whole scroll. It's there's several places in the scroll which are transitional, you might say, nothing happening in them, but quite beautiful passages of foreground rocks and slopes with crests, these lovely crests that Shaogui loves so much. Foreground trees, middle ground trees more simply drawn, and then distant mountains. But space, mass and space, wonderfully represented mass and space. The rocks, as you see, have some remnants of the old Li Tong manner axe cut texture stroke, but very broad now. And the old Weitong manner of rendering the sides of them, some darkened, some lit by light. All this is so easily done now that you're scarcely aware of it. A quite dramatic pine tree here at left against the mist. In the next section, we have a huge boulder in the foreground and more mist beyond, and then the beginnings of the section which you have shown from the first lecture on, I think several times, so you're familiar with it by now. The section in which one of these sort of climactic bits of the painting in which you see people arriving at a temple. Okay, there's the transitional bit, and then next, please. Here's the section which you know very well from. I had it on for a long time in the first lecture. And this is what I reproduced, I think, in this, no, not here book, but in other places reproduced it. Here's the Qianlong Emperor's inscription up in the upper sky, but we sort of ignore that. He should be ignored generally. Bad poetry, badly written. Anyway, bad verse, not even poetry. And here, anyway, the upper right is one of those lovely crests that Xiaogui paints so well, with shaped, dimly shaped, in contrast to the further ridges and mountains, which are simply in silhouette, and trees growing out from it. But in the foreground, we see one of the focal points in the painting, where we're sort of invited, so to speak, to stop and gaze for a while. First of all, there are two pilgrims with broad hats and one of them carrying a load. Buddhist pilgrims, it looks like, making their way into the picture and across the bridge. And then across the bridge and in the space in front of the temple are two of these Gaosher lofty scholars and their servant, and rock seats. Here's a detail of that section which shows it more. Yes. One of them is turning to the servant, the other stands holding his staff. And they are about to enter the temple. They've come there to enjoy the scenery, to visit the temple, perhaps to have some spiritual event in the temple, and maybe stay there for a while, rest, and then go on. The temple buildings drawn among the trees, this is quite wonderful. Nobody else is able to integrate architecture and trees with this ease, and the ease also with which he draws the tree groups. Foliage not carefully distinguished, but distinguished enough so you can distinguish the individual trees one from another, according to the kind of foliage or leafage, and the nearer ones on the right and the slightly further ones on to the middle left, distinguished in their tonality, ink tonality. And then up above, next please, here's the roofs of the temple and the crest up above seen in detail. All of this handled with such ease, with no clear sign of the artist's hand or no showy brushwork or any of that stuff. He's way beyond that. He is able to shape this bluff up here in the upper right so easily that you just read it in its shape, and you read the trees growing on it without being at all conscious of the painter's hand. Okay, now here we go on. Then a transitional bit here. Here's a detail of it, in which we see another old scholar down here arriving with his staff bent over, showing his age, and his servant coming along behind, carrying the usual wine gourd, whatever it is, something to eat maybe, over his pole. And then the huge boulder that sort of pushes us off into the next section, which is as you remember, a recession along the riverbank. And here it is. This is just beyond what we've just seen. Boats moored. The old guy that we just saw making his way toward the temple has come from one of these boats, and then the shoreline goes back, and we've seen these already, but I'll show them again. Here is the fishing village with thatched roofs, buildings, two people meeting in the foreground, dimly seen, buildings on the shore, and a fishing, the device for raising the net in the lower left here. This, of course, goes all the way back to the Cahill1 painting. We've seen numbers of these done carefully or understandably as here, or done sloppily as we saw in a painting by Wang Shun, an aristocrat artist. Anyway, okay, I won't go that again. But throughout here, when you blow this up, it's a little like the painting we saw before, probably by Li Sung of the West Lake, in which the artist is able to blur and lighten parts of the painting to somehow reproduce the experience of seeing something through mist and at a distance.